right? Is anyone really happy the way we're dealing with race in our country today? Let me see your hand. Either you're lying or no one's really happy. Is there a better way? And I think there is. And I think it's located within our faith. I'll tell you something about myself. I am a Christian and I'm a scholar. And both of those things matter. And I believe that good theology and good science work together. And when they disagree, you either have bad theology, and sometimes you got that, or you have bad science, and sometimes you got that. Sometimes you got both. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research out there, but I'm also going to make the argument that there is a path that our Christian faith directs us towards in an issue like this. And that's why I've named the, is the PowerPoint ready? Yeah, go ahead and put it on. No? Okay, there we go. Can Christianity teach us anything unique about racism? Can it teach us anything unique about racism? Okay, first, let's get started. We live in a racialized society. What I mean by that is race matters. Next slide, please. A society where race matters profoundly for the differences in our life expectancies, our experiences, our life opportunities, and social relationships. In other words, because I am an African American, that has impacted me, impacts my experiences, impacts my opportunities. Now, it could be negative, it could be positive. When I was younger, I liked to play basketball. I walk on the court, they say, hey, what did the black guy play? It can be negative. And we'll see some examples of that real soon. Race matters. We live in a racialized society. All right. There are two facts that are almost indisputable as far as a racialized society. First fact, we are here after a history of racial abuse. No doubt. Do we need to talk about slavery or the internment centers or the reservations, or do I need to go on? No one disputes that. Second fact, which is hard to dispute, that type of structures of racial abuse are illegal today. You can't make someone a slave today, unless they're your kid, of course. You can't have internment centers today. How do we deal with these realities? Because that abuse has had an effect on today's society. And yet, what we're doing is no longer being done. So how do you deal with those realities? There are two ways people are trying to deal with the realities today. Two ways. The first one, conquering views about racism, and how to deal with it. The first one is colorblindness. Next slide, please. The first one is colorblindness. Under colorblindness, racism is something that is overt and only done from one individual to another. So the solution is we ignore race. The solution is that we go, okay, you know what? I don't see race. And that is what some people are arguing. That's the way we deal with the realities, that we don't have these mechanisms we used to have, therefore, we have a playing field, even playing field, let's ignore race. Colorblindness. That's one way. That's one, and some Christians have said this is the Christian way. All right? It's not just the world that says it. Some Christians say this is the Christian way. The second is called anti-racism. Now, I use that term. I can use other terms, but it's the popular term of art today. And here, people argue that racism is structural as well as individualistic, and social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. All right? So a lot of this is what's been called anti-racism. When I was writing my book in 2020, that was the term. I read the major popular anti-racism books so I could understand what people were talking about. And there's other terms people have used throughout the years. We'll stick with anti-racism right now. Once again, this is what's out there in the world. And some Christians have said, this is the Christian way. So we sound like everyone else. So why should anyone listen to us? Okay. I say both of these are wrong. And what I'm going to do this morning is talk a lot about why they're wrong. I'm going to get a little bit about what I think is the right way. Unfortunately, because of time, I can't really dive deep into that. So here's my plug for tonight. Tonight I'm going to repeat a lot of what I'm doing because I'm going to have people here who wasn't here this morning. But I'm also going to dive much more deeply into the solution. So I know I'm going to get the solution short shift this morning. But before we can get the solution, we have to know why that's wrong, because why it's wrong gives us the solution. Let's look at the first one, color blindness. All right, color blindness makes sense if we have a fair society. But do we have a fair society? Is color blindness viable? Next slide, please. Research says it is not. Let's look at some of these studies. This first one, there's no real difference, no real decrease in racial discrimination over the past 25 years when it comes to occupational hiring. And the way they know this is through something called an audit study. Now, an audit study is when you take a black or Hispanic and a white person, and they apply for the same job, and you'll see how they're treated. And you use something like a name in order to, like Leroy, that's probably a black guy. Juan, that's probably a Hispanic guy. I don't know, Russell, is that a white guy's name? I don't know. Frank, I don't know. They apply for the same job, and this is not just one study. This is called a meta-analysis, which is a lot of studies. And what they found is that over the past 25 years, if you have a white-sounding name, you're more likely to be called back for an interview than if you have a black or Hispanic-sounding name. Now, note, this is not, it was really bad 25 years ago. It's still there, but it's gotten better today. There's been no decrease in the past 25 years. So you're thinking, hey, we're not like our parents. No, you're the same. Okay? As far as African-American or Hispanic-American getting a job, it's the same thing as it was 25 years ago. Driving while black. I mentioned, playing basketball while black is good. Driving while black, not so good. This study was based in Ohio. There's been other studies based in other parts of the country, so I could have, there's 2 or 3 studies I could have put here. Basically, the African Americans are pulled over more than European Americans. Now, that would make sense if blacks drive worse than European Americans. So during these studies, what they do is they look at blacks and whites and how they drive. And what they find is that we blacks drive as bad as you whites, but not worse than you whites. There's the one time in which you don't see driving while black, and that's at night. Because at night, how hard is it to see the rest of someone in the car? Residential segregation. Cities are divided into black areas of town, white areas of town, Hispanic areas of town. And what this research has found out is that impacts the schools you go to. So what happens is if you go to a predominantly black school or predominantly Hispanic school, you get a lower level of education, or you get a different emphasis. I actually didn't go to a black school in high school. I went to a Hispanic school. I won't go into why, it's not that important, but I did. And our Hispanic school, it basically sucked in everything, except one thing. One thing we won state every year and wasn't even close, and that was the industrial arts. We knew how to build houses. Now, that is an honorable profession, nothing wrong with it. The 2 white schools, they were sending kids to college. We're learning how to build houses. And who runs our country? People build houses, as important as they are, or people go to college? This is why residential segregation matters. One of the reasons why. There's many reasons why. And then there's the healthcare system. Now, during COVID, you may or may not know this, but African Americans and Hispanic Americans were less likely to get the vaccine. One of the reasons why is evidence like this, where there's racism. I think they looked at 37 studies, and in 26 of them, they found evidence of racism. How people they were treated, what they were prescribed, all of these things. So if your interaction with the healthcare system is when you encounter racism, chances are pretty high you don't trust them very much when they say we have a vaccine. All this is to say is that colorblindness says, hey, let's ignore race because everything's fair, and yet and I could have put a lot more. We could spend the whole half an hour looking at research on this, okay? But we have other things to do. But society is not fair on race. So what you're asking people of color to do is, hey, you have all these wounds. We're not going to bandage them up. We're just going to ignore them because we're going to be colorblind because everyone's equal now. Colorblindness does not work. Well, what about anti-racism? So I told you I read a lot of the books out there on anti-racism. And while this is not an exhaustive list, I found 3 themes in those books that I found in almost all those books. First, anti-racism is very proactive in dealing with racism. It says, hey, we're not going to wait around. We're going to actually do something. We're not going to wait for racism to happen. We're going to seek it out and stop it before you even get started. Second, it works to dismantle all aspects of racism. So it's not just about an individual racist. It's about our institutions, our systems, some of the laws that we just talked about there, or some of the propensities we just looked at. Now, I tell you, if this was what anti-racism was, and this is all that it was, I'd probably say I'm an anti-racist. Because I think we should be proactive. I think we should not be settled with just individual racism. The third point is very problematic. Responsibility of whites is to do what people of color want. Now, I've done this talk several times. No one has challenged me on this point, because my challenge would always be, okay, find me the anti-racism book that does not do this. I'll give you a classic example from the one that was the most popular in 2020, White Fragility. How many of you have read that book, by the way? Okay, a few of you? There's a passage in the book that really sums up her expectations, because you read the book, it's like, what are whites supposed to do? We can't cry, we can't complain, we can't do anything. Literally, if you read the book, that's the impression you get. And there's one passage where she says, wouldn't it be wonderful if whites listen to people of color and then promise to do better? A version of that I find in all anti-racism books that I've seen thus far. So, yes, dismantle racism. People of color tell whites what to do, and they do that. Well, as an African-American man, that sounds great, but does it really work? Well, let's look at the research on that. Next slide, please. So one of the things they talk about is diversity training. Teach people to do these things. And here's what we know about diversity training. It has little long-term effect on prejudice. Well, what could happen is you get a temporary dip in prejudice. All right, you can get a temporary dip, but it's kind of like sending you off to youth camp. You came back, you're on fire for the Lord, and then 3 months later, it's blah. That's kind of what happens. So you have a temporary effect, but no long-term effect. It can generate a backlash. Go ahead and put the slide back up, please. A backlash against people of color. So what can happen is you do diversity training, and instead of whites rallying to people of color, they resent the training, and they get a backlash. Teaching about privilege can create less sympathy for whites, but does not increase sympathy for African Americans. So what this research did was she taught a group about white privilege. At the end of the day, the level of sympathy for marginalized whites, homeless whites, whites who may be on substance abuse, in domestic violence, that went down without increasing in sympathy for people of color. So overall, your sympathy for marginalized individuals decreased because you cared less about whites, but you didn't increase your caring about people of color who are marginalized. I read a article not too long ago about a person in the class asking about white privilege and saying, well, do you mean that the daughters of President Obama are worse off in every way than poor whites living in Appalachia on food stamps? And they said yes. Anti-racism. Now this is an interesting article, and I wish I had time to really parse it out, because it really shows that when you do things such as mandatory diversity training, grievance committees, and companies do that, 5 years later they actually have fewer managers of color. So we can say, we need anti-racism, we need to increase managers of color. You do anti-racism and you actually will have less managers of color 5 years later. So If we wanted to design programs to work that really increase diversity, which really help reduce racial alienation, we would not do anti-racism because the research shows it does the opposite. So, we have taken sides for two approaches that don't work. All right, so let's try to build something that does work. Here's the truth that both approaches lack: human depravity. Now, before you say, well, yeah, they see human depravity in certain ways, they don't see human depravity because human depravity is about all of us. It's not about a single group, it's about all of us. When you think about human depravity, the person you start with is you. I mean, say, yeah, that person's deprived. It's you. Because you start with others, then you get the pride thing going for yourself, and then that's human depravity. You start with yourself. Next slide. There's a lot of scriptural backing for human depravity. Those are just 3 of the verses. If you really want to do a search, you can just, you can use Google now and just go human depravity, Bible, and you'll get a bunch of verses. It is a core element of our Christian faith. Now, I know that there's some theological differences between how people interpret it, but think about it. Why do we need Christ? Because we're fallen. It starts and ends there. We need Christ because we're fallen. If I could do it on my own, I would, because that's who I am. I can do it. I became a Christian because I realized I couldn't do it on my own. All right? So this is not some sort of tangential type of, this is an core element of our faith. And it helps us to understand things. Here's a real key, because human depravity is one of those things that we don't talk about a lot, understandably. But it's one of those things that really differentiate us from humanistic philosophies. Go to the next slide, please. When I was in graduate school, I learned about the Enlightenment movement. And the Enlightenment movement had a principle known as human perfectibility. Now, the idea was that as we cast off our superstitions and as we cast off our old beliefs, we humans will perfect ourselves and society. If you know anything about Marxism, that's a good example of that. Marxism, if you know anything about it, talks about how we're going to eventually lose our false consciousness and eventually create this great society. And it's not just about the great economy, but everything else will be great. There's other versions of that. Well, human perfectibility, it says that humans become better with education. We will educate people, and then they will become better. And the reason why is humans are rational creatures who can be convinced to become better. So rationality is a part of who we are under Enlightenment thinkers. Now, when I was learning this in grad school, I didn't have any kids. Now I have a 7, 6, and 4-year-old. I was like, where's all this rationality you're talking about? Now, here's the key as far as race. You say, what does it do with the race? If you follow this, then you can create a better society if you follow your insight. So if our insight, be it anti-racism or colorblindness, is adopted, we can move to the end of racial alienation. This is an Enlightenment philosophy. When people adopt anti-racism or colorblindness and say, let's make sure that we get this, you're saying that you can create this perfect society if everyone can follow what you're doing. And it's not just the anti-racist, because people say, well, yeah, I see the anti-racist, but colorblind just want to be left alone. A couple years ago, I went for knowledge, so I went to that fountain of knowledge called Facebook. And I was, because I was raising boys, and I, wanted to know a little bit about how do I talk to them about things such as, dealing with the police, as an African American, and some of those sort of things. So I posted that in Facebook, trying to get some response from some of my friends who are also raising kids of color. I got some, but I also got some pushback. No, I'm not talking about any sort of public policy, or I'm not, criticizing a politician or a movement. I'm just talking about raising my own boys, as African American, good Christian African American men. My pushback was that was wrong. Don't worry about them being good Christian African American men. Worry about them being good Christian men. Why are you bringing race into this? Why are you talking about race? So it was interesting that, that individuals, mostly white, were telling me as an African American that I should ignore race in raising my boys. Be sure that those pushing colorblindness expect everyone to abide by it. If everyone does what we tell them to do, we will create utopia on the racial level. My argument is that what we are doing as Christians is we're buying into a secular way of dealing with racial issues, and no wonder we can't get any progress. All right, human depravity. What insight does it give us? Humans are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. Now, I believe in education. You all are here getting educated. You know, education is a great thing, but does it really help us morally? A friend of mine did this research, because if you do surveys, one thing you'll see is that highly educated people are not racist, because they fill out on their surveys that way. And so you do a survey, and among whites, the more educated they are, the more likely they are to say that they will live in an integrated neighborhood. The more educated they are, the more likely they are to say that they will send their kids to integrated schools. And so what my friend did was, says, okay, cool. Then he looked at where whites actually lived and sent their kids to school. And he found, and after controlling for other factors, so this is not an income effect or anything like this, he found that the more educated a white person was, the less likely they were to live in an integrated neighborhood, and the less likely they were to send their kids to an integrated school. Which brings the question, what if education does not make you a better person? What if instead it teaches you how to hide your immorality? Education does not make us better. More knowledgeable? Yes. Get a better paying job? Yes. Nothing says it makes you more moral. Only by accounting for our desire to protect our self-interests can we deal with racial conflict. So we enter into this knowing we have a self-interest in this, all right? So I have a self-interest. I'm an African-American man. Now, there's all sorts of things that come with that, and we can talk about justice and all that, and that is appropriate. But I cannot forget that I'm an African-American man and I bring a self-interest into this conversation. You do too. None of you all are neutral or anything like that, okay? I've said this stuff a long time. I try my best to be neutral. I still fail. Holding each other accountable, can we find solutions to racial alienation? Have you ever wondered, we talk and talk and talk. Let's talk more about race, and we get nothing done. And the next incident comes up, and then everything explodes again. And it's like the talking did nothing. You know, a lot of time, I just saw this research that shows that we feel worse about racial situation today than we did 10 years ago. We had a black president, and yet we feel worse afterwards. We need to talk in ways that's constructive, that builds rather than tears down. Okay, next slide. So I sometimes call this collaborative conversation, sometimes call it a mutual accountability approach. Here's what I'm talking about. It's a Christian-based approach whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that's to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has to work toward healthy interracial communication to solve racial problems. All right, so let me say what this is saying, what it's not saying. What it's saying is, I don't care what your race is, where your position is, if you want to enter the conversation, you have to do it in a way that builds healthy conversations. Now, tonight I can go a little bit more on what that means, but it has to be a more healthy conversation than what we're having today. We all have that responsibility. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the solutions are going to be that we're going to each have equal responsibilities at the end of it. We have a history of racial abuse. That has impacted our society. When we have these conversations, what I find is the solutions take that into consideration. So if you're saying, well, let's have everyone have this equal conversation, we'll come with a colorblind solution. Could that happen? Sometimes it could happen. But a lot of times it's not going to happen. But how we get there is very important. If I had the perfect solution, I say, hey, here's what we need to do, A, B, C, D, and E, you're going to look at me like, okay, this is an African-American man telling me what to do. And so you might get a backlash. If you had a chance to interact, to create that solution, then we work together instead of against each other. And so much today, our polarization in our society and the church really being just as polarized as everyone else, what are we showing? We could show in a post-Christian world a better way. All right, now I looked at research on the other approaches. Is there research on this one? Well, there is empirical work on healthy interracial relationships. Next slide, please. We know that under the right conditions, interracial contact helps to alleviate bias. Under the right conditions, not under all conditions. Under the right conditions, we can alleviate bias through interracial contact. We also know that having a common group identity increases positive feelings. So y'all were just up here talking about, hey, support the Crusaders, and I forget what sport, was it basketball or some sport? Support the Crusaders, because you go to the Crusaders game and go Crusaders. And at that time, you have a common group identity. And whoever else you're playing, I don't know, who's y'all's rival? Ermin? Okay. Your rival, whoever that is, boo them, yay us. Now, yeah, obviously that there's a limit to this as far as, you're having negative feelings towards someone else, but your positive feelings towards each other, right? What if we could sort of extend that to say, our common group identity is we're all image bearers? Perspective taking has been shown to be effective in long-term change of behavior. And part of what collaborative conversation is perspective taking. And I don't have time to go into it this morning. But when you take the perspective of others, that creates long-term changes. When others try to force you to change, we tend to resist that. Collaborative communication and atmosphere of mutual support create volitional compliance and satisfaction. Volitional compliance, working together instead of tearing each other apart. My fear is, what happens is one group wins for a little while, and then they get what they want, and the other group is waiting to destroy them so they can get what they want. The cycle just continues on and on and on again. Skill development, a key. Part of it is we don't have the skills developed to have these sort of conversations because we're so used to try to score points on each other rather than have productive conversations. Okay, implication of this approach. All right, first implication. No one has all the right answers. We get better answers by listening to each other. Now, there's research out there on that when you have more voices, you actually get better answers. And one of the reasons why diversity is a great thing, all right? Now, the problem is when diversity means that you're shutting out voices. And I know certain voices have been shut out in diversity programs, so I'm not unaware of that. So we need to do it better. We need intentional efforts of collaborative communication. This will not happen naturally, unfortunately. It happens when we work at it. We have to learn. We have to develop skills towards it. As a researcher who interviews individuals, I've had to learn how to engage so I can listen actively in a better way. The needs of everyone must be respected. Wouldn't it be better? Here's a good analogy. Let's say the problem is, you have two people who live in a room and whether to open the window or not. And people are arguing, I want to open, I want to close. So instead of saying, well, let's just halfway open it, why not find out why people want to open or close? So you respect their needs. What if the person wants to open because they're hot? Well, maybe you can close it and get them a fan. Or a person wants to close because bugs are coming in. Well, maybe you can put a screen on the window and solve that problem. Why not focus on solving the problems rather than winning? Skills of active listening and productive communication is valued. When it comes to active listening, do we listen to hear what other people are saying, or do we listen to score? Communication, talking to people in ways that can hear you. If you talk to people in a way that they feel threatened, they can't hear you. They literally can't hear you. They'll be sitting there smiling, but they can't hear you. Work towards solutions are win-win instead of win-lose. Is this a direction to go, or do we want to do what we've done before? Now, you may come in here supporting colorblindness or anti-racism. I ask you to consider, if you do the same thing and get the same result, we call that insane. Is this not a direction we should go as Christians? And as a Christian body, we go this way and show a world that's lost a better way. Once again, in a post-Christian world, what sort of effect will we have? If you want me to dig deeper into this, come back tonight. Blessings on all of you all. Have a great class.